think we're about ready to start. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. My name is Wade Henderson, and I'm President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's leading civil and human rights coalition with over 200 national organizations working to build an America as good as its ideals. We are here today with members of Congress and civil rights leaders representing the broad diversity of our nation to stand unified in our support for passage of the bipartisan Voting Rights Amendments Act. Now, the reality is that right now in America, the right to vote for all is under grave threat. We're approaching the June 25th one-year anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which struck down a key section of the Voting Rights Act that determined which states would fall under the pre-clearance provisions of the law. In its decision, the court noted that Congress has the power to draft another formula based on current conditions. Now, in turn, the Bipartisan Voting Rights Amendment Act was introduced here in the House and in the Senate this past January. The VRAA, as it's known, is a modern, flexible, nationwide approach to protecting voters that responds both to the spirit and the letter of the court's decision. In the Senate, the legislative process is well underway. On next week's anniversary, the Senate Judiciary Committee has scheduled a hearing on this important bill. But the House Judiciary Committee has failed to schedule either a hearing or a markup, and the House leadership has yet to commit to give it time on the floor. Now is the time for Congress to act. All of the organizations assembled here today represent a diverse cross-section of our nation. We are unified in our belief that advancing this bill through the congressional process is essential to protecting the right to vote and to creating a modern, forward-looking Voting Rights Act for the 21st century. Now, voting is the language of democracy. If you don't vote, you don't count. This principle has been echoed time and again by resounding bipartisan majorities in Congress and by presidents from both parties. The issue of voting rights is and will forever be a matter of national concern, and the House Judiciary Committee cannot shrink from its historic obligation. After next week's Senate hearing, our organizations and many others will host a rally to underscore our simple but urgent request. Give this bill the benefit of a full-throated congressional debate. Now, I'm joined here today by Representative Marcia L. Fudge, Chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Rubén Hinojosa, Chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Representative Judy Chu, Chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, Lorraine Miller, Interim President and CEO of the NAACP, Mi Mua, President and CEO of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Brent Wilkes, Executive Director of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and Elizabeth McNamara, President of the League of Women Voters. We are also joined by another number of members who are standing here to show their support for this important legislation. Representative Gwen Moore, Representative Joyce Beatty, Representative Bobby Scott, and Representative Barbara Lee, former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Now, please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Congressman Marcia Fudge to the podium.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be very brief because I think all of us have something to say that is significant. But I just want to say that as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act and the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, it should give us all pause to realize where we are today. I am going to call on Chairman Goodlatte today to do what is right, to help us all to fulfill the real promise of America, and that is that all of us are equal, and we should all have an equal opportunity to vote. He is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee of all committees, the one who was supposed to make sure that justice is done. So let's do the right thing, Mr. Goodlatte, and call for a vote on this bill. I further want to say that as we look back on Freedom Summer 50 years ago, it took all of the people of America to give black people the right to vote 50 years ago. If you recall what 50 years ago was Freedom Summer, you know that people, young people from across the country went to Mississippi to try to get black people registered to vote. Most of those young people were not black. Most of those young people were white. So they knew at that time that it took all of us to make a better America, and we are better together. And so all of us have a right to participate in the franchise of this country. It is a bipartisan bill. Voting is a bipartisan act, and I'm asking Chairman Goodlatte today to bring this bill to the floor.
I want to thank Wade Henderson for your leadership and for leading us in this press conference that we're having. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Congressman Rubén Hinojosa, chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I left another meeting going on over at the Capitol on the issue of immigration reform. But I came because this issue that we are covering here at this press conference is extremely important to our whole nation. I come from a family of immigrants from Mexico who came to Texas in 1910. That's over 100 years ago, 104 to be exact. My mother had 11 children, and she was very interested as a child of the discussions that were taking place by her parents and her grandparents, and that was the fact that they could not vote. And so she taught us, all 7 brothers and 4 daughters that she had, taught us that we had to stand up and speak up, and that the day would come when all of us would be able to vote. And so when Wade said, if you don't vote, you don't count, that reminds me of this wonderful woman who lived to the age of 95, had 11 children, 40 grandchildren, and 58 great-grandchildren, and taught them all the importance of voting. And so it is with great pleasure that I join my colleagues, CBC Chairwoman Marcia Fudge, and CAPAC Chairwoman Judy Chu, and all others who were introduced by Wade. The right to vote is the core of the American democracy. Yet this right to vote is under attack, and we must act now to change that. Across the country, in states like Colorado, my own state of Texas, Florida, and Arizona, there are still cases of voting discrimination, big time. These states have a large Latino electorate, and in those states we are seeing efforts to suppress the Latino vote. More than ever, we must ensure that Latinos are able to exercise their constitutional right. Our community is rapidly growing, and the Latino vote has never been more important. Latinos make up over 10% of the nation's voting population. 5 million Latino citizens turn 18 years old every year, and that's over 50,000 Latinos who reach voting age each month. In the aftermath of the Shelby County decision, there are now 7 million Latinos living in jurisdictions previously subjected to the pre-clearance requirement who are without vital voting rights protection. We must stand up and defend the right to vote for people of color. I join today all those with us here at this press conference and many of you here in this press conference, call you for action on the Voting Rights Amendment Act, which would provide legislative solution to this problem and which has bipartisan support. There's a lot at stake here. We must protect all voters, and we must act now before the upcoming November elections. Thank you, and I yield back.
I'm Congressmember Judy Chu, Chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. Today, almost 1 year after the Supreme Court's Shelby decision, I stand here once again with the chairs of the Congressional Tri-Caucus, Congressmembers Fudge and Hinojosa and the other Congress members here, to urge Congress to pass the Voting Rights Amendment Act and restore the crucial protections that were gutted in Shelby. The American electorate is increasingly comprised of communities of color, and as our populations continue to grow, it is critical that these voters are able to fully participate in the political process. Failure to fix the Voting Rights Act will give states and localities the opportunity to discriminate and disadvantage our communities. It allows regions in our country to step back into a time of Jim Crow and Chinese exclusion, times that have left a permanent scar on the communities of color discrimination. I commend Senator Leahy for his leadership in scheduling a judiciary hearing on the Voting Rights Act in the Senate. It's a promising step, but I urge my fellow colleagues in the House Judiciary Committee to follow suit. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Lorraine Miller, the interim president of the NAACP. This is a critical time for action. As we approach the anniversary of Shelby versus Holder, we must act with renewed urgency in advancing the Voting Rights Amendment Act through the congressional process. The looming risk of voter disenfranchisement threatens our democracy. Voter restrictions from state legislatures have brought forth court rulings that leave uncertainty as voters prepare for the 2014 midterm elections. Even in the last few days, a Brennan Center report states that of the 11 states with the highest Black turnout in 2008, 7 of those states have new restrictions in place, and of the dozen states with the largest growth in Hispanic population from 2000 to 2010, 9 of those states have passed laws that make it harder to vote. So in light of these findings, the NAACP has issued the following call to action for full civic participation and representation in 2014. Those include 4 points. 1, engaging directly with members of Congress to call for hearings in the House on the Voting Rights Act amendment. 2, enlisting registered voters to assist elders and first-time voters with securing all of the required documents and identification in order to register and vote. 3, encouraging faith leaders to educate their congregations on the importance of being registered and voting in all elections. And finally, 4, educating and deploying our network of 2.5 million digital activists to support unfettered access to the polls and urge that every vote be counted. Ladies and gentlemen, failure to advance this legislation gives a free pass to voting discrimination. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mi Moore, and I am the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Almost 1 month ago on May 15th, Advancing Justice AAJC stood with the Leadership Conference, the League of Women Voters, LULAC, and the NAACP to ask our congressional leaders to hold a hearing on the Voting Rights Act amendment. The Senate heard our call and heed our voices, and today we're looking for the same leadership from our House. Today, AAJC is proud to stand with our partners again and these congressional leaders to send exactly the same message. Voting is a fundamental right, and it is the cornerstone of a sound, healthy, and inclusive democracy. As Congresswoman Judy Chu has commented, dating back to the 18th century, the Asian American Pacific Island community were effectively denied the right to vote from prohibitions on our community's ability to become citizens. It was only through the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that voting began to become accessible to all Americans, including Asian Americans. With over 17 million Asian American and Pacific Islanders across the country, our community is the fastest growing racial group in the United States. We are rapidly growing in states and localities that were historically covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. States such as Arkansas, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, and Virginia. The Asian American community has a stake to the urgent solution to this concern. Every day that Congress fails to act, voters are in danger. As have been stated already, we've seen state and localities brazenly moving forward, potentially discriminatory changes to voting rights regulations, changing district boundaries, and moving polling locations. So today, on the eve of the 1 year.
My name is Brent Welks, and I'm the Executive Director of the League of United Latin American Citizens. I'm also the Vice Chair of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, a coalition of the nation's leading and largest Latino organizations in the United States. And I bring you both the LULAC organization's strong support of moving forward with the Voting Rights Act, as well as all of the member organizations of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. We believe that the right to vote is absolutely critical to all the issues that we focus on, whether that's educational opportunities, workplace opportunities, immigration reform, healthcare, even housing and health and civil rights. Those are all dependent upon the right to vote, the unfettered access to the polls. That's why this issue is absolutely critical, and that's why there is universal support for this. I'm delighted to be here with our congressional leadership of the Tri-Caucus. They are incredible leaders, and they've been standing strong on this, but they need help. And we did meet with Chairman Goodlatte as a coalition, the member organizations that are here today, and he told us, I'm not convinced. I want to see proof that there is a need for restoring Section 5 and the whole focus on pre-clearance, as well as, of course, the Section 2 that's already part of the Voting Rights Act. And we've answered the call, folks. This is a report issued by the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. It details in here 19 cases that have occurred just in the last few years, examples of where states have moved to prevent Latino voters to have unfettered access to the polls. Proof right here. Chairman Goodlatte, we've sent this to you. It's time to act. And if you look through this and read through this, there's three very important populations that we're very concerned about that have been impacted by these 19 cases. First are those folks who are turning 18. They're among the most vulnerable people. And we have to make sure that the Voting Rights Act amendment deals with their specific needs. In addition to that, highly mobile voters were impacted by these cases significantly, folks who are moving from one state to the next. They've got to have their rights protected as well in the Voting Rights Amendment. And then third are folks that are very important to LULAC and to many immigrant communities, those newly naturalized voters. We have to make sure that their rights are protected as well. We can restore the Voting Rights Act, and we can make it better. And we can make it serve the needs of all of our communities, because the truth was there were states that weren't covered by preclearance in the past, and we've got to make sure that all folks are covered in this. That these highly mobile voters, these immigrant voters that are newly naturalized, and of course these young folks are covered as well. So that's really important to us. But the most important thing is we've got to act. And so we stand with our colleagues and say, let's hold those hearings, Chairman Goodlatte, and let's move this to the floor if you don't want to hold the hearings, because we can vote right now, we can get this done. You voted for the Voting Rights Act's reauthorization. That was bipartisan, and it was overwhelming. Why can't you vote for this now and get this done and make sure that all of us have unfettered access to the polls? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Elizabeth McNamara, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters. And I'm very, very pleased to be here to add the voice of our 150,000 members and supporters to the voice of those who are here in this room. The past year has been one of profound emotions for those working to protect the right to vote. Nearly 1 year ago, the League was deeply dismayed by the Supreme Court's decision gutting key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. At the same time, we were hopeful that the Shelby County case would serve as a rallying cry for those who believe in free and fair elections and the right of every eligible voter to cast a ballot. Together, we turned to Congress to restore the vital voter protections the Supreme Court dismantled. And thanks to the hard work of so many, we were once again hopeful when the Voting Rights Act Amendment Act, was introduced in January. At the time, I spoke out on behalf of our members and supporters, praising the work of the bipartisan group of legislators that drafted and introduced the bill. These elected officials did something that is rare nowadays. They put aside politics to govern. Their goal was to ensure that each and every eligible voter is treated fairly at the ballot box and has an equal right and equal access to vote. Together, these lawmakers forged workable, common-sense solutions that would modernize the election process and protect voting rights against discrimination. Now, nearly 6 months after the bill's introduction and 1 year after the Supreme Court decision, we are still waiting for Congress to finish what it started. We are thrilled that the Senate is holding hearings on the VRAA next week on the anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision. But we need more. We need the House of Representatives to stand alongside their colleagues in the Senate to stand up to discrimination by keeping action on the VRAA moving forward. Sadly, discrimination at the ballot box is real. In just 5 short months, voters will once again head to the polls in the 2014 elections, and voters will do without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act that the Voting Rights Act had afforded them for more than 40 years. There is no need to put voters' rights in jeopardy in this election or in any other election. This isn't complicated. The VRAA is the remedy that will help ensure equal access to the vote for all eligible voters this fall and for future generations of Americans to come. As constituents and voters, our members have been urging members of Congress to act swiftly on the VRAA. As national president for the past 4 years, visiting leagues in more than 30 states, I can tell you from personal experience, league members will not back down. They demand action. We've called upon our grassroots to contact their representatives and senators, and they've responded. We've sent over 60,000 messages to Congress calling for swift action on the VRAA. We cannot allow politics to stifle this bill. We are gathered here today as a show of unity and to deliver a message to Congress that we are serious about protecting voters. The League has been at this for a long time, more than 94 years, and we certainly are not stopping now. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks to all of our speakers, and most especially I want to thank the chairs of the Tri-Caucus organizations for their participation today. Because we know that members of Congress have pressing matters this afternoon, including votes on the House floor, I want to invite questions to any of our congressional members, the representatives, the chairs of the Tri-Caucuses, and also the other members who are here. So if there are questions to be posed, we'd like you to pose them to the members. Yes, ma'am, and please introduce yourself.
I am a part of a task group that has spoken with the Republican leadership. I am a part of the task group that has spoken with the Republican leadership. They are not inclined at this point to bring it to the floor. They see no urgency. And quite frankly, they are playing politics with this bill and do not want to bring it to the floor before the election. They don't even understand that this is the people's house. and we represent the people. And they have ignored their responsibility not only to this Congress, but to the people of the United States. So unless we make them do it, they are not going to do it.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Please, yes.
Would it be, if anybody could say why you think the DOP has no urgency, and is it possible, does it make sense to make a parallelism between this and immigration reform bill? Are there the same causes holding this bill, holding the other bill? I ask because many of my readers are more familiar with the immigration topic, so maybe.
Thank you for that very good question. The answer is yes. There's a lot of similarity. Immigration reform was introduced and passed in the Senate last year, and we've had all these months to be able to bring a similar bill known as H.R. 15 on immigration reform, and they have refused to bring it to the floor. So I can tell you that the response that was given earlier as to this Voting Rights Act amendment that we want to come before the House has exactly the same strategy, and that is to delay it and delay it and delay it. And we have to stand up and be counted. That expression that you used at your beginning of your statement, if you don't vote, you don't count, well, that is the reason why we want to be sure that this legislation is voted on, just as we want immigration reform to be voted on. So that's the response to your question.
Can I just say this as well? It is so closely aligned you can't imagine. They don't want anybody that they think won't vote for them to vote. So they don't want any people of color, they don't want the poor, they don't want immigrants, they don't want anybody to vote that they think will not vote for them. So of course you now have an immigration bill that they don't want because they figure that's more voters against them, and you have a voting rights bill. They don't want either to pass because they're afraid that they will lose, but they don't realize they've already lost by disenfranchising the American people.
There is a parallel with the immigration bill, and I just came from an immigration meeting, and the constituents said that they have occupied the offices of 23 Republican House members and got commitments from 8 of those members to speak to Speaker Boehner about putting the immigration bill on the floor. And then there's going to be more occupations this coming week. So we have to ratchet up the pressure. Basically, they have to feel it in their districts from the constituents who are in their districts in order to get them to move. But I really think it is the voice of the people that can get them to move.
So there will be occupations as well for this bill, like they have been for immigration? Are there plans for that?
Well, there will be a rally next week on the day that the Senate Judiciary Committee holds its hearing, which is the one-year anniversary of the Supreme Court's Shelby County versus Holder decision. But this is really the beginning of the process, and we're beginning to push more aggressively for a hearing in the House of Representatives. We have made great progress in spreading the message, the important message of bipartisan support. And I want to note that there are 14 House Republican members who are co-sponsors of this bill. Several of them are members of the House Judiciary Committee. That's a good sign. Voting has always been a national issue, and in recent years, the Voting Rights Act has enjoyed strong bipartisan support. And I should note that the lead sponsor of the House bill, Representative James Sensenbrenner, a former chair of the House Judiciary Committee, has been a leader on voting rights reauthorization, both in 2006, when he was the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House, and in 1982, which was the previous period of reauthorization for the Act. So there is a strong history of bipartisan support. But that history cannot overcome a willful disregard of the importance to consider this bill and the underlying merits which compel Congress to act more immediately. And that's the argument that we're attempting to make now. Any additional questions